For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Editor Mbongiseni Buthelezi discusses the book titled Traditional Leaders in a Democracy, Resources, Respect and Resistance. Tell us about the two remarkable court cases that form the basis for this book.
So that's a chapter by Standi Weyeni, and the one chapter in a place called Makasaneni in KwaZulu-Natal, where there was a license given to a mining company to come and prospect for iron ore without any consultation of the people in the area by the traditional authorities. And so what happens is people wake up one morning and they find people digging holes, probes into their grave sites, into their plowing fields. And what has happened since then is that actually the chemicals that were used in that prospecting process have completely destroyed the soil. So people can no longer use the soil. They can no longer plow in places where they used to plow. So it leads to a big conflict in the area between the traditional leader, the Inkosi, and people in the community. But the people of that particular community have got the support of the headman, the Induna of the area. And between them, they then go into this major conflict with the traditional leader, the Inkosi, which then drags in the police, it drags in the traditional, the provincial cooperative government's department. And what ultimately we see in that case is that, and it's a big trend we've seen in South Africa since the advent of democracy, which is that the laws that have been passed by the state are progressively supporting unaccountable power, the unaccountable power of traditional authorities, where they are bypassing communities, especially in places where there are mineral deposits. And most of those areas, if you think of the Platinum Belt in the northwestern Limpopo, for example, are the areas into which people were pushed under apartheid and colonialism. It's land that was not valuable previously. And with the discovery of minerals in the 60s and 70s, that suddenly became some of the most valuable land in the country. And it's created these contentions between leaders, between communities, but also, it raises a lot of questions about the nature of the democratic settlement in South Africa, about how traditional authorities have been accommodated in the democracy. And we see some traditional leaders actually in the book writing about their own views of that settlement.
What kind of relationships should we expect from traditional leaders as well as government?
It's a difficult relationship. Traditional leaders and government in South Africa, what we see, Nkosi Phathekile Holomisa writes a little bit about it. Nkosi Nokonyana writes a bit about it in the book. But also other authors pick up the question of that relationship. Denoas Kosana writes about the longer history, the relationship between traditional leaders and the ANC, going right back to the founding of the ANC. But what we've seen, I think, in the last 2 decades or so, is that there's been tension. It's uneven, of course, in different places, the relationships are different. But overall, it's an uneven relationship full of tension. And the reason for that largely is that if you look at the Constitution of South Africa, it recognizes in Chapter 12 traditional leaders subject to the Bill of Rights, subject to the Constitution. And the question then becomes, okay, what should be the appropriate relationship? Are traditional leaders subject to the state in South Africa and therefore subject to government? Or is there an autonomous sphere in which they should exercise authority? Traditional leaders in the book argue, the two traditional leaders, that prior to colonialism, there was a sphere of authority and of autonomy that was occupied by traditional leaders in their communities, and they've come to be subjected to a state, which is a later imposition. And therefore, we should return to a situation where they have a sphere of autonomy, where they are in charge of local government, for example, which was the case in many places under apartheid. Now, the question that arises out of that, of course, is that how it was prior to colonialism, or is the kind of power that traditional leaders want, kind of an unaccountable power, what they were given by colonial laws and by apartheid laws. And so you have this ongoing debate that has not been resolved, and this tension between government and traditional leaders on one hand, between traditional leaders and communities in some cases, and in some cases then it becomes a tension between communities and government.
What kind of relationships should we expect between traditional leaders and government?
So some leaders, I mean, if we look at the history of South Africa, there's some traditional leaders. I mean, even if we go back to Dineo Skosana's chapter in the book, she discusses the relationship that has existed between the ANC as a liberation movement and traditional authorities, which itself has gone through these ups and downs over time. At the founding of the ANC, I mean, one of the key moves that as the South African Native National Congress at the time, which later becomes the ANC, it creates a house, an upper house of chiefs, as a recognition that the struggle, I think, between the struggle for land ownership, for example, in South Africa, is a struggle that involves people, individuals, communities, but it also, in some cases, involves traditional leaders as people who have been given authority over people in their communities, over land. So some leaders play a critical role in the formation, in the existence of the ANC on one hand. But on the other hand, some people continue to play a role in communities without being part of the formation of any political party or movement, as part of resistance to colonialism, resistance to apartheid. It's uneven, of course, because over time what we see is we know that also some leaders collaborate. So we end up with a situation in present-day South Africa where some traditional leaders are people whose authority, whose own positions come from being conferred upon them by laws under apartheid, under colonialism. They come to be traditional leaders in cases where there are forced removals in some cases in the 1950s, 1960s, and people get pushed by apartheid into the authority of traditional leaders in some cases that they don't recognize. So that's why we've got this unevenness and these kinds of tensions. And so what we've tried to do in South Africa post-apartheid is to create a blanket system where through the constitution, through legislation, we try and create a uniform system that exists across the country. But historically, we know that different communities have had different systems of leadership. Prior to apartheid. Different communities that are in existence today have had different historical trajectories. Some of them are communities in which people, like I've said, were placed under the authority of traditional leaders they did not recognize by apartheid power, by colonial power. And so it's a very uneven system. And so the question of whether traditional authorities should continue to exist is one that is difficult to resolve. It has not been resolved by the state because it's such a contentious and such a vexed question. And there are multiple reasons for that, including the fact that some people hold on to, and what has been revealed in, say, Aninka Claassens' chapter in the book, where she quotes from the high-level panel in Parliament and the hearings that the high-level panel led by former President Motlanthe held across the country. People say, we recognize the authority of chiefs, the legitimacy of traditional authorities. It's not that people don't want traditional authorities. What people are against in many places is the unaccountable power. It's the cases where traditional authorities enter into mining deals on behalf of communities without consulting communities. And when there are royalties, mining royalties, that are supposed to be going to communities, huge sums of money disappearing, like in the case of the Bapo in the Northwest, for example. In fact, in the case of the whole Northwest, there were these so-called D accounts that existed under the Botswana law, under apartheid. And there were huge sums of money in mining royalties that are supposed to go towards community development that have simply vanished. And in many cases, the public protector has done some investigations on this. There's been no accounting from traditional leaders, but also from the state. from the Premier, for example. I mean, in some of the cases, people have gone all the way up to the Premier's office. They've gone all the way up to national government in Pretoria to try and ask for interventions. And there's been no accountability for money that should be going towards community development. So these are the things that create tension and that are very difficult to resolve, because the issue of where authority lies, what legitimacy should look like, are continue to be vexed issues.
Please tell us about the role that was played by the Institute of Strategic Reflections in this book.
So this is a MISTRA book, a MISTRA publication. And MISTRA has a relationship with Jacana Media. Jacana is the publisher, and there's an imprint, as far as I understand, a MISTRA imprint. So MISTRA initiated the whole project. They then contracted me and the other editors to edit the book. And so we came in from outside. Well, there was one of the editors, Beth Vale, was a staff member at MISTRA, who anchored the whole project from the MISTRA side. So we were tasked with then with conceptualizing the book, with identifying potential contributors to the book, inviting them to contribute, and then putting them in touch with MISTRA for contracting purposes, etc. And then driving the whole project to the point at which a book was complete, a manuscript was complete, handed over to MISTRA and then to Jacana for final editing, printing, etc.
What kind of challenges does the book address that traditional leaders face?
So it tries to deal with this question of, we've had 25 years almost of democracy. And in those 25 years, there were certain assumptions that were made by scholars, by activists, leading up to, well, actually not even in the 25 years, leading up to the end of Apartheid. One of the major assumptions was that the institution of traditional leadership would wither away and die over time, because as democratic norms took root in South Africa, people would turn around and reject traditional leaders. But what we're seeing is that in those 25 years, the institution has had what some call a resurgence. In that resurgence, there are all sorts of tensions that have been created between, as we've addressed, between the state and traditional leaders, between traditional leaders, traditional councils, and communities, between investors who want to invest on land, mining companies being key players, and communities and traditional leaders and the state, etc. It's all in this, I think, in this process of really us working out in South Africa what the post-apartheid dispensation should look like. So the book addresses this question of what remains unresolved and what are the ways in which we can resolve those kinds of tensions. We've had also a history of scholars and activists pushing back very hard against traditional leaders, arguing, and some arguing that traditional leaders really should not exist, that it's an institution of the past, that it does not fit in with democratic norms, democratic principles, democratic values. And so the question remains, it still remains, because it's an institution that is here to stay. And if it's an institution that's here to stay, the way it's been accommodated into the democratic dispensation is incomplete. It's been a cause of tensions. How do we resolve these tensions? I mean, the one big example of this is what happened in South Africa in the 1990s, of course, was that we established what is called wall-to-wall local government. That every piece of land in South Africa should be covered by a municipality, which we did not have in the past, prior to the establishment in 1998 through legislation of these wall-to-wall municipalities. Now, we established these municipalities, we actually placed them on top of pre-existing traditional authorities. So we've had this massive tension between elected councillors and hereditary, mostly male, traditional leaders. So on one hand, we've got this question of, okay, when it comes to traditional leaders, this is a hereditary institution where people are not elected. They simply attain a position by virtue of being born into the right family. Mostly, these are also, I mean, traditional leaders are mostly male. And so how does this sit with these other values and norms we've established? Values of equality in the Constitution. How do we create a situation where it becomes also normal for women to become traditional leaders? So the question of gender is a central one that we need to address when we're thinking through this. How do we resolve this tension between traditional leaders and elected local government? In many cases, what we've seen, and there's been some marvelous scholarship around this, is that at local level, people have entered into these negotiations where the authority of the traditional leader begins and ends has been negotiated with the authority of the elected councillor begins and ends. And so between the councillor and the traditional council, the traditional leader, they've sort of negotiated contingent local arrangements. And so an attempt to then have blanket laws that apply across the country runs up against that tension, where in one community, in one area, something very different has evolved in KwaZulu-Natal, in an area in Eshowe, for example, compared to an area in Venda, in Limpopo. And so to try and then establish laws that can cover the whole country becomes very difficult. We have some framework laws that were then meant to be followed through with provincial laws. In some cases that has happened, but those have also themselves created new kinds of tensions. So it's all these things that we need to resolve, that the book tries to think through.
In most cases, we speak about senior traditional leaders. Can you tell us about the role that is played by the lower level traditional leaders, normally known as tribal policemen?
In Cindy Somnisi Weeks' work, and in her chapter in the book, and in fact over a longer period of her career, she's done some fascinating studies looking at some places in Mpumalanga and in KwaZulu-Natal at other layers of traditional leadership. And she argues in her chapter, for example, that we've focused too much at the senior levels of kings and queens. That's the level at which even legislation is pitched. What legislation has not recognized, and in fact, I think she's absolutely right, scholars, activists, etc., have not talked enough about the levels at which people interact most with traditional leaders. So is Nduna, in the language of KwaZulu-Natal, for example, is Bonda in the Eastern Cape. Those are leaders at a level below the senior traditional leader, where if in a community there are tensions, for example, that's where people turn to mediate those tensions. There are also, there are people who are mostly responsible for land allocation in communities. It's that level at which most of the work is being done. And if you begin to focus on that work, like Cindy Somnisi Weeks does, you begin to see something very different. She argues in her chapter, for example, that what a lack of focus at that level has done is that it has disadvantaged communities, especially women who live in traditional authority areas. But it has also put it at a disadvantage the leaders themselves, the Izinduna, the Izibonda, because they are completely unrecognized. There's been some moves more recently to confer recognition at that level and to begin to even remunerate people who are at that level. But it's really just the beginning of that conversation, and I think Nisi Weeks' intervention is a key one. It also affects things like traditional courts, where this gender question really comes up very strongly. Some of the work, again, Nisi Weeks and others have been doing over a longer period, where the question of if we have these traditional courts and we have legislation before Parliament that's going to be taken forward in the new Parliament after the elections, the Traditional Courts Bill, which has been resisted very strongly in some quarters by activists, in fact rural activists, people who live under traditional authorities, who say there's a problem with these courts. And the way in which the legislation is moving is to take us into a situation where these traditional courts are recognized and are legislated into being, but they are discriminatory against women. Women, in a lot of places, women cannot represent themselves in traditional courts. So this goes against the spirit of our constitution. Is this something that should be allowed, that can be allowed in our democratic dispensation? Again, these are the tensions that we're facing.
Chapter 3 explores the relationship between the ANC and traditional leaders. It was interesting to note that Nsebenza viewed the relationship as one-sided. Can you unpack his argument?
Well, Nsebenza is cited in that chapter. So it's a chapter by Dineo Skosana, in which she takes issue with some of the ways in which scholars have viewed the relationship between traditional authorities and the relationship between the ANC and traditional authorities, but also between the state and traditional authorities. Again, the starting point of some of those arguments, in Nsebenza's case, is to assume that there is no compatibility between this hereditary institution and a democratic dispensation, and the norms of a democratic dispensation. And Nsebenza has argued in various pieces of work over the years that the two cannot be married. That ultimately what is going to need to happen is that the institution of traditional leadership it has no place in a democratic dispensation. So what Skosana's chapter does is to show the tensions over a period of more than 100 years between the ANC and the institution, and the codependence, as she calls it, in that chapter, of the two institutions. So in fact, it links very nicely to another chapter in the book, the final chapter, by Nkosi Nongonyana. Nkosi Nongonyana shows the negotiations that have happened in his chapter, and he shows how at various points, he refers to an instance where there was, I think it's in the year 2000, if I remember correctly, where there were local government elections approaching, and the Contralesa in the Eastern Cape took government to court to try and interdict the holding of elections until certain tensions had been resolved between traditional leaders and government. And they lost the case in court, but that also shows the way in which these relationships have evolved. There have been moments when there have been negotiations. That chapter shows moments when then President Thabo Mbeki had a meeting with traditional leaders, and they set up a task team to try and figure out a way of resolving these tensions. And ultimately what Nkosi Nongonyana says is that there have been undertakings at different times, including as recently as 2018 by the current Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Minister Zweli Mkhize, to take forward some of those agreements of how traditional leaders would be given power and authority at the local level. And he says there's no political will to take that forward. Agreements get reached between traditional leaders and government, and the government never follows through. But I don't think that's entirely accurate. Because if we look at the chapter was written last year before the events that have taken place since the beginning of this year. I should point out that Parliament in February and March, the National Assembly, acquiesced to two laws. The traditional leadership and traditional Khoisan leader, the TKLB, traditional and Khoisan leadership bill, which is now sitting on the president's desk, awaiting his signature. But also the traditional courts bill has also been accepted, processed through Parliament and accepted by the National Assembly. The problem is, of course, there's major resistance to those laws. There's pushback. There's a march being planned for the 29th of April, a march on Pretoria, on the union buildings in Pretoria, by communities from across the country that are saying, stop these Bantustan bills that government is bringing back now. Traditional and Khoisan leadership bill, what it does, according to the argument in opposition to it, is that it's going to give, again, further unaccountable power to traditional leaders. It gives the power to traditional councils to enter into deals with investors on land on behalf of communities, without quite placing the onus on those traditional councils to consult communities fully. So it's taking us back to the tensions that we've been seeing in South Africa over the last few years, but it's giving powers that apartheid laws had given to traditional authorities back to traditional authorities again. So there's going to be massive resistance with this march coming up on the 29th of April, and further action is going to follow from there.
Lastly, what kind of feedback have you received since the book was published from those who have read it?
So far, very little feedback. I think it's a relatively new book, and it hasn't quite been taken up yet. There've been, from people we know in the circles that we know, people have been very excited about a new book that tries to put together the big picture of what has happened with traditional authorities and government and communities in South Africa. So it's generating some excitement. I know that from some of the people we know, for example, certain sections of it, certain chapters are going to be taught in university classes pretty soon. So we're hoping that, we've offered something here, and other people will take the conversation forward. Some people will write against some of what is in the book, will argue with some of the offerings in the book, which is, of course, the nature of the debate that we're trying to start with this kind of book. So we're hoping that debate will ensue from what is offered in the book.
That was Mbongiseni Buthelezi speaking to Polity about a book titled Traditional Leaders in a Democracy, Resources, Respect and Resistance.